What's up, guys? This is Mr. Eldridge, and in today's video, we're going to look at the Reconstruction period. This period is from 1865 to 1877. As the Civil War was coming to an end, Republicans in the North wanted to make sure slavery could not return. To do this, Lincoln and Republicans had to push for a constitutional amendment to end the institution of slavery. In order to pass this new amendment, 2/3 of Congress had to propose it, and 3/4 of the states had to ratify it. For the proposal to pass the House of Representatives, the Republicans needed some Northern Democrats to vote in favor of the 13th Amendment. Unable to bribe, Lincoln appealed to the lame duck Democrats, those who had lost their elections but were still in Congress for the next 2 months. And he did this through federal jobs. To procure the votes, Lincoln used Secretary of State William Seward to offer them government posts and jobs to provide them with secure income after they were leaving office. Quickly after the 13th Amendment passed in January of 1865, the ratification of 3/4 of the states, other measures were passed to protect freed blacks. Most of these measures were initiated by radical Republicans that were demanding equal rights and protection for those freed blacks. One of the most famous of these, of course, is going to be Thaddeus Stevens. Two examples of this are the 14th and the 15th Amendments, which were ratified by 1870. The 14th and the 15th Amendments were responses to discriminatory local policies known as black codes, which limited black movement, bound them to sharecropping contracts, denied them suffrage, and barred them from any form of firearm. The 14th Amendment guaranteed citizenship and equal protection under the law for all born or naturalized United States citizens, regardless of their race. The 15th Amendment was passed to prevent race-specific voter suppression. Even though under the guise of the Jim Crow laws, we are going to see literacy tests, poll taxes that would make it difficult for freed blacks as well as poor whites in southern states. President Andrew Johnson was left to dictate Reconstruction without congressional interference, as they were out of session, and specifically, they were out for the rest of the year. To the distaste of Republicans, Johnson felt like southern states should be readmitted without penalty as equals. They also opposed Johnson's view that suffrage should be a state issue and not a federally guaranteed right. Following the congressional elections in 1866, far more Republicans were voted into office. Tension between Johnson and Congress was high, as seen by the impeachment of Johnson by Congress in 1868, when Johnson allegedly violated the new and controversial Tenure of Office Act, which forbade a president from dismissing a cabinet member assigned during his tenure. Under Congress, as well as through the presidency of Ulysses S. Grant, southern states were divided into 5 military zones. Union soldiers enabled black voters, and many southern Democratic leaders were either banned or absent. The Freedmen's Bureau was established by the federal government to direct provisions, clothing, and support for the temporary shelter and supply of destitute and suffering refugees and freed blacks. It also required by law, according to the Reconstruction Act of 1867, for southern states to officially recognize black emancipation, citizenship, and suffrage before being readmitted to the United States. As a result, Northerners controlled the South, and Southerners saw Northern business and soldiers as aggressive and opportunistic occupiers. Northerners who moved down to profit were known as carpetbaggers. Southerners who worked with Republicans were known as scallywags. Both groups were generally detested and shunned by those who were considered loyal Southerners. By the mid-1870s, mounting military costs and a lack of Republican fervor and support for Reconstruction resulted in Southern Democrats return to power as Union troops began to withdraw and political bans were overturned. Southern Democrats soon began to try and return conditions to as close to the antebellum South as possible. Small opposition groups, such as the Knights of the Ku Klux Klan, appeared in resistance to post-Civil War conditions. In the South, these groups received little resistance from local law enforcement. Sharecropping was used as a means to keep blacks and poor whites bound to the plantation economy for a small share of the crop. Additionally, Southern states and local governments used a legal loophole in the 13th Amendment to exploit the use of labor as a form of punishment. Southern vagrancy laws made it easy to arrest people, particularly emancipated blacks and poor whites, to imprison and lease out for cheap manual, quote, convict labor. And finally, it's important to understand, after the Reconstruction movement, you're going to begin to see the segregation of the American South. With the 14th and 15th Amendments outlawing the disenfranchisement, Southerners turned to legal segregation as a means to persecute blacks. In many states and local state governments, it was required by law to create separate facilities and accommodations for whites and blacks. Such oppressive legal policies were upheld by the Supreme Court in the infamous Plessy versus Ferguson case in 1896. Which found it legal to segregate rail cars and all things by race so long as the facilities were equal under the law. As such, the policy of separate but equal was the status quo until civil rights challenges emerged in the 1950s and 1960s, especially with the case of Brown versus the Board of Education. Segregation laws from 1877 to 1965 are often referred to as Jim Crow laws.